This talk is going to be about Bible interpretation and the texts of terror. I have titled this talk in this way because specifically in the areas of gender and sexuality, the Bible can seem like a very confusing and offensive book, especially for modern people. In our time together, I'm going to give you a couple of tools and methods to help you read your Bible, understand the style in which different parts were written, and I'm going to encourage you to do this with other people. While these methods will help you read any part of the Bible, for this talk we're going to focus on how to interpret some of the harder and possibly offensive parts of the Bible. That's where the name Texts of Terror comes from. Now, we may start with this term, which even has the word terror in it, but I believe that this terror is a starting place and hopefully not where you're going to end up after a faithful and persevering Bible study. We can see who God is and find him to be trustworthy through the correct reading and understanding of even the most difficult texts of the Bible. All right, I have something to show you, but I want to give you a heads up. While I edited this little clip to bleep out a swear word, the man who is about to speak is going to speak crassly, and he is going to be deliberately shocking. I'm showing you this for a couple of reasons. First of all, it serves my content, but I want to set the tone for the time together in this talk and the series of talks that is linked with this. This series of talks is a place where the goal is to address and counterbalance some of the lies and questions that are going on in our culture, on the internet, in our hearts. And I believe, and the Bible says, that God has given us what we need to equip us for life in godliness through knowledge as given in his word, which is the Bible. But I want to give a heads up that the content of the Bible can be graphic, it can be shocking, and that's what we're going to address in our talk for tonight. So, with that being said, this video will speak more crassly than I intend to in the time following. All right, here goes.
You all want to look at some more absolutely bonkers Bible stories with me? Why? Because they're kind of f***ed up. Do I need a better reason? Trigger warning, violence and gore. It's the Bible after all. Alright, let's go. That time some kids made fun of Elisha, calling him bald, and so he cursed them, and God sent 2 bears out of the woods to maul 42 of them to death. That time Onan was obligated to sleep with his dead brother's wife, but he pulled out and finished on the ground so she wouldn't get pregnant, and then God killed him for it. Yes, I knew that story when I was 8. Anyone else? That time Samson took a donkey's jawbone and killed 1,000 soldiers with it because he had superhuman strength from never cutting his hair. Goals. That time Jesus was feeling so peckish that he killed a fig tree for not having any figs for him to eat, even though figs were out of season. Kind of a dick move from the tree owner's perspective. That time the Apostle Paul said women should be quiet in church, and then people kept taking him seriously for 2,000 years. All right, that's it for today, but there are hundreds of these, so come along if you want more for some reason.
Now, that guy, his name's Abraham Piper. He is the non-Christian son of John Piper, John Piper is a faithful Bible teacher who gets quoted a lot in certain church circles, certainly my church circle. Abraham, but again, John's son Abraham does not follow God. Abraham said something that was interesting though. He said he knew these stories by the time he was 8 years old. In the group of students who I work with, I'm in my 30s, my students are in their teenagers. In my group, we began reading through the Bible in a 2-year reading plan during their freshman year of high school. So, by the end of last year, they had read through pretty much everything that Abraham alluded to. We've covered most of it. So my first point is going to be an encouragement to keep that up. Actually right in line with what he was saying. So either keep that up or get that started, and I will show you why. So my first point for correct Bible interpretation in the texts of terror is read your whole Bible. I have read my Bible, here it is, cover to cover many times, and there are challenges in, I'd say, every section. But like I stated above, we can trust, or stated earlier, we can trust God that he's given us a good thing in his word. I believe the easiest and most important key to reading and understanding the Bible is just to read it. So let's use an example from Abraham's video. His last point was that part in the Bible where the Bible told women to be quiet in church, and they listened for 2,000 years. So that's a big statement, and one which I would propose is historically and even currently inaccurate. But you don't need to be a historian to see that. So I'm going to ask you a question you can answer in your head. Can you think of a part of the Bible where women's words have either been directly quoted for God's people? Some of the things that come to my mind are there's one of the older ones is Deborah's song, is an entire passage. Miriam also has a song, and that's Aaron and Moses' sister. We have direct quotes by Esther. We have direct quotes by Jesus' mother Mary. There are many parts where women aren't, quite literally in the Bible, are not silent. Now, here is what happened with that TikTok video, though. This is a Bible passage. It is in the book of 1 Corinthians. It says, women should keep silent in churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they should be in submission, as the law also says. If there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for women to speak in church. Again, that is a quote. That is the end of the quote from the Bible. So the video took that idea, which again I was reading and quoting directly from the Bible, and it shortened the idea, condensed it, and turned it into a burn. So without getting into again the historical and even the present experiences of people, the Bible itself, and by reading the whole Bible, it'll help us know what to do and how to think about these things. So let me show you again with this book. Remember, point 1, read the whole Bible. This quotations is not on some random list of ranty rules. It is part of a small section. It's called the Book of Corinthians. And this was a letter written to a specific people living in a city called Corinth in a time where people across the world were learning how to establish church communities and learning how to follow Jesus together. There was a man named Paul. He was one of the main teachers in the Bible and in the early church. Paul preached sermons and whole letters that he wrote, like 1 Corinthians. Now, just a couple of chapters, so they're divided in our Bibles into chapters. When it was first written, it was one cohesive letter. So just a couple of chapters for you to access. In your Bible, it'll be in chapter 11. Paul writes about how women should present themselves, appearance-wise, when they pray or prophesy in a church service. Praying or prophesying, those are spoken things. These women were speaking in church. This is a quotation. It's from a paper by a church, the Village Church. The paper is The Role of Women at the Village Church. Quote, Paul's concern is not whether men or women will prophesy. He assumes both will, but the way in which one prophesies. It seems that this text demonstrates that women participated verbally in the earliest church services. This text secures a vocal role for women in the public worship service. End of quote. So when we look at this whole letter, we see the whole picture. The letter of 1 Corinthians is trying to describe how God's people should act in orderly worship. Since in chapter 11, Paul is talking about how women should pray or prophesy in church, it cannot mean in chapter 14 that he means they're to be absolutely silent in church. So then what does he mean? There's several different possible ways to understand this. I've done some additional reading, and one example, which I like, by a guy, his name's Kenneth Bailey. One example of how to understand this is that in light of the rest of Paul's writings and the time and the place where it was written, the passage could perhaps be understood as women don't chat in church. Perhaps this passage is discouraging disruptive, disrespectful speech and not necessarily all speech. So to do a little bit of a deeper dive into that idea, First Corinthians was written to a culture where, so in modern American church services, we tend to segregate the children to other areas during the teaching part of a church sermon. During this time and in this place, it probably, we don't know these things for sure, but probably men and women would have been taught in separate areas in the same room, and the women would have had their children with them. Well, again, elsewhere in the same letter, Paul is talking about how do we have orderly worship, and he was encouraging that when people would speak, that they would be speaking when they would speak in tongues, that there would be somebody to interpret. And so he was speaking to correct a situation where perhaps there would have been a lot of people speaking in languages or in manners that would have been really confusing for, and even impossible to understand for everybody in the room. Now, take this picture where you have some people speaking out in very confusing ways, maybe even unintelligible, and then you have women with their children where they can't even understand what's happening. And you have this picture of women either chatting with each other, addressing crying children, there's disruptive speech going on over here, and it just becomes chaos. And even you could extrapolate that a little further and have a picture of women even correcting their husbands. Maybe their husbands are the ones speaking up and they're saying, stop it. And so all of a sudden we have a very wild worship service, which is not in line. Once again, God is, he intends for clarity. He intends for people to be able to understand. And there are ways that human interactions work and the way that they don't. So again, that's a deeper dive of what that passage could possibly be talking about. All right, so once again, though, the passage is discouraging disruptive, disrespectful speech, not all speech. Now, if a person had not looked at this whole letter, they could just be left with that one quote, "It is shameful for women to speak in church." Furthermore, one other little danger of Bible interpretation. Sometimes we can come across a passage like this that is confusing or upsetting, and people will look at just one passage and then they'll zoom in on one little word and they'll start kind of playing games with the language in a way that can get confusing. So they may say, well, did you know that verb which says to speak, maybe that doesn't mean to speak. Maybe that means, and then they start getting into ancient languages and how a word could have been understood in an ancient language, and then our Bible's been translated. Once again, I encourage you, read the Bible as a whole, and think of, when you're thinking about translation and interpretation, you can trust that speech and language, it is possible to understand what somebody, even a foreign language speaker, is saying. As you're really looking into texts, one other little thing to, when you hear a word or possibly an interpretation of a word that could be confusing, just look at several different translations of the Bible. As we're thinking about language and how to understand language, one of the easiest tricks is just read 3 different translations, maybe your NIV translation, the ESV translation, and the CSB translation. When you look at several different things, you can get to better understanding of the actual language. That's like if I were saying speak, talk, and communicate. Those are all kind of synonyms that get to the same root of meaning, which is there and which we can understand. All right, once again, I want you to come away from this. When you're seeking to understand something, don't worry as much about a deep dive into word by word. Read the entire Bible. This is closely related to my second key for interpreting texts of terror. Point 2 is know your genre. So Remember when I talked about 1 Corinthians being a letter? Well, this is an interesting thing about the Bible. It is one book, the Bible. It's an authoritative collection of works given by God to humanity. It is a collection, and it has all kinds of different types of writing, which are called genres. A genre is a recognizable type of writing with a certain style, purpose, and features. This is one of those things that you're familiar with without even thinking about it. Let me show you. Okay. Eggs, milk, butter, flour. I will be there later. Can you please make sure to bring the lunches? At the same time, the bishops and clergy who had been banished by the Arian monarch were recalled from exile and restored to their respective churches. The Donatists, the Novatians, the Macedonians, the Eunomonians, and those who, with more prosperous fortune, adhered to the doctrine of the Council of Nicaea. Those were all different genres. We have a shopping list, we have text message, and we have a passage from the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Likewise, the Bible is composed of works of history, poetry, letters, and two genres which aren't super common in our culture, prophetic and apocalyptic writings. Knowing this information, that the Bible is composed of different types of works, is vital for understanding it. Again, we know this already. You read your shopping list differently than you read a text from your mom. You interact with a YouTube video about the Titanic differently than a FaceTime chat with your grandma. But what would happen if you didn't know how to handle genre? What if, for example, you acted like your grandma's FaceTime call was an educational YouTube video? Your poor grandma would be so confused while you just stared at her talking without responding. Again, we know this intuitively. It's obvious when we think about it like that. But remember that TikTok from Abraham. He said, "Remember that time when Samson killed 1,000 people with the jawbone of a donkey? Goals!" So he's being sarcastic, but it's actually a super good point. I'm prone to doing this. I will hear a story about someone being awesome, and then I will try and copy that person. Samson's a strong warrior. Okay, I should be more brave. But is that the point of the history that God depicts in the Bible? To show me who to copy? To set goals? Not really. So something that I love about the Bible, specifically when it portrays history, is that it is true. The people in the Bible play by our rules. They move in our world. With genre, in the fairy tale genre, people go through something hard, but then they live happily ever after. In the Bible, people will often go through something hard, and then it gets harder. That's something we can all relate to, and since the Bible is about God, God's people, and God's plan, we can observe how God works through history, and we can learn about people. But, like with the Samson thing, the point of history isn't always this black and white, copy this, do this, this is what God loves, this is what he hates. We have to be so careful to know our genres and what kind of writing that we're interacting with and to apply it correctly, especially when we come across something hard. Telling history, being honest about history, is different from saying, here is what you should do. Two quick rules for history. History is, once again, what God will teach you about God, his people, and his plan. And to paraphrase Tim Keller, anyone who reads an account of that account like that of Samson, where there's blatant immorality, womanizing, deceit, dishonoring of Samson's parents, and thinks it's a prescription for how we should live, simply doesn't know how to read. Samson left a wake of broken lives and broken bodies, including his own. Once again, when we think about the Bible being true to how life works and true to how people work in this world, when you look at Samson's, when you look at his life from a perspective of not what should I imitate, but what's happening here, it actually tells a story that's a lot more true to what we now understand as an addiction spiral, where a person does more and more daring and self-destructive behaviors because there can be, again, in an addiction spiral, there can be more incentive for the dangerous. You need more of a substance, more of a thrill, more danger to get the adrenaline, to get the dopamine. And you see Samson walking exactly down that path where there's this increasing self-destruction. And so it's a lot more like an addiction spiral than a go be strong like Samson. So know your genre. Another example of knowing your genre is there's the book, The Song of Solomon. It is one large poem. Now, sometimes we can take the book Song of Solomon and we go, it talks about sex. We should do exactly what the book is talking about. And so people have taken this poem and they've extrapolated from it various different types of behaviors, various different types of roles. They've said things like, from Song of Solomon, we can see that God commands that marriage is between one man and one woman. And anyways, again, they'll do a lot of extrapolating from poetry. And while you can, point one, read your whole Bible, while there are themes about romance and love, and there are very clear passages that talk about how God created marriage, how God created male and female, there are clear passages for that. But Song of Solomon and Song of Solomon is between a man and a woman, and things like that are very clear. It's a poem. It's going to be evoking pictures. It's going to be about metaphors, about images. It's the story of a man and a woman in a garden. There's conflict. It talks about shame very poetically. I would contend that it's a little bit more about love in a post-fall world rather than a prescription for how to be married. But again, when you're taking a poem and trying to make it a list of rules, that wasn't the intent of a poet. It was more to describe and to have you enter into a sensory experience rather than to give you a dry list of rules. So, the next point in the talk is take the interpretive journey. So, to rewind back to our history with Samson, what do we do with, say, a historical text in the Bible which portrays extreme violence, sexuality, or gore? I'm going to show you a way to think about Bible interpretation, which is called the interpretive journey. So you can think about it like you're going on a trip, and actually you have started out at the place of your destination place, and you're going to come back home. Okay, so first you're going to read the text in their town. So think of it like you are in a foreign place and you're seeing what did this text mean to the original readers. So try and put aside your initial bias, even some of your initial questions, and do the work to, just like what we talked through with Paul in 1 Corinthians, where you're thinking of this as, okay, step one, a guy wrote a letter to people. And so when they're reading it, they're not, the original audience couldn't have been like, but what about, how do we think about filming a woman talking through Bible interpretation? Is that a woman speaking in church? Well, that's a good question. Paul wasn't talking about that. Paul was speaking to a group of people rooted in time in a specific place. Okay, so they weren't putting on an American video gendered understanding of that text. They were just listening to a letter that a man that they knew were writing to them. So step one, what did this text mean to its original audience? So you're going to be thinking about what time was it written, who's the intended audience, and what are some of even some of the basic understandings that that culture would have had. Step two, measure the width. Think of it like, again, step one was grasping the text in the original town. Step two is imagine that there's a river between you, your home, and this other town. So first, measure the how wide this river is. What do we need to know to interpret this text correctly? I brought up Song of Solomon. The ancient way of poetry was a little bit different than how we write poetry in my culture. In American culture, we tend to have poetry be like A to B to C. Now, ancient Hebrew poetry was a little more circular, okay? So you have A, and then you could actually think of it as a bit of like an A prime. Like there's a device, it's called a chiasm, and it's like a little mountain, all right? So you have idea one, idea two, idea three. And then you have idea two revisited and idea one revisited. Again, it looks like a little... And so it's a bit more of a circular and developing way of thought instead of a beginning to end way of thought. So you're taking ideas and you're building on them. You're following up. The central point is kind of the main idea. It's kind of the climax and the turning point. And so you're going to see images and ideas portrayed a little bit differently. But the first time that you come across a poem written by a culture 2,000 years ago in a poetry style that you don't really understand, that's a pretty wide river, okay? There are some, you may need to, in a deep study of something where you find a text to be very confusing or offensive, you may need to do a fair amount of work to learn how did Hebrew poetry work? How did letters written to ancient people, how were those read? How were those presented and understood? So again, step two, measure the width of the river. What do we need to know in order to interpret this text correctly? Now, you can imagine you've grasped the text in their town. You've kind of, what do I need to understand? You can think of it as then building a bridge, all right? We can call this the principalizing bridge, okay? So when you make a principalizing bridge, you're taking an idea that you can pull out of this text. And so you're starting to remove it a little bit just from, okay, here's a poem written 2,000 years ago by some guy, and now you're starting to take ideas like I had mentioned the idea of love in a post-fall world. So you have ideas like, wow, there's some conflict in this poetry, but at the same time, there's some really strong feelings. And so you're starting to just pull big ideas and big themes and form principles. Now, once you're forming these principles, you have to then consult. You can think of it as, you're in this town, you've measured the river, you're building this bridge, but before you're going to finish building the bridge and actually cross it, you need to get out your map and make sure that you're not going off into crazy land, okay? So, point one, read your whole Bible. The map that you're consulting needs to be the biblical map, okay? Think about other texts in the actual Bible, okay? So, in Song of Solomon, there's a point where it talks about how the queen has all of these wives and all of these concubines, the king has all of these wives and all of these concubines, but his beloved is the most beautiful and the only child of her mother. Well, you could pull that principle. You could make a principle from that, and you could go, Sometimes when you have a lot of people that you're sleeping with, one person is better than anyone. That would be an example of an incorrect principle. Anytime, remember what we were talking about with reading history, anytime in the historical texts that we get a picture of polygamy, even with the man Solomon who wrote Song of Solomon, Solomon, his heart was led astray by his many wives, and that it was in fact because of the strife and the warfare among Solomon's descendants from all of these different wives, that we went from a time in Israelite history that was the United Kingdom to the divided kingdom, and then the people were even exiled. So any time that there is polygamy, and we see this polygamy having multiple wives, we see this in the strife between Jacob's wives and Jacob and his wives. We see this in with Abraham. We see many, many times where whenever somebody has multiple sexual partners, or like with Sarah when she's in the harem of a foreign king, there is disaster that follows in the wake of this. And so it is not a correct principle to pull out from one verse the idea that, for example, polygamy is okay. You need to consult your biblical map. Look at texts in the Old Testament. Look at texts in the New Testament, which is Jesus's life, the texts that deal with Jesus's life, death, and resurrection, and everything that followed. Old Testament is what comes before that. Consult your entire Bible as you're forming principles and seeking to understand text. And then finally, the last step in this journey is being able to understand the text in our town. So that final step is where we're starting to be able to say things like, is it okay for me to, for example, again with the Song of Solomon idea, is it okay for me to date multiple people? Is it okay for me to marry multiple people? And that's, hear what I did right there. That's saying, is it all right for me to do this? That's me living now, interacting with the people in my life, with my church, with my Bible. That is the last step. You shouldn't just be read the Bible. How does this apply to me? Read the Bible. How does this apply to me? It is clear, it is possible to understand these things, but often it comes at the far end of a fair amount of thinking and a fair amount of work, and you don't need to be afraid of that process. You don't need to be afraid of the journey, but it is something to do wisely. And that's why my final encouragement when it comes to reading the Bible is, and especially when you find a difficult text, because you don't maybe necessarily need to do the entire interpretive journey before every single time of reading. There's sometimes when it's okay. You can just read it and even take things at face value. But when you come to a difficult text, read in community. Note how this is the last thing that I said. That's for a reason. We have a God who is near. He is not far off. He has given us his word. He's not trying to trick us, even though the Bible does have parts which may at first seem to be hard or confusing for us to read. But reading the whole Bible, understanding what kind of text we're reading, and taking the interpretive journey will help you see a text for yourself. You can do this. You do not need to have a degree in ancient Hebrew or ancient Greek. You don't need to do all of that kind of deep word by word kind of digging. You are able, the way that language works, we are able to understand. We're able to read for ourselves and understand for ourselves. At the same time, one of my favorite ideas is that we can stand on each other's shoulders, so to speak. We can learn from each other and we can be better for it. So a couple of the things that we have, which can be tools that we have, which can be really helpful when we come to the Bible are, for example, commentaries. this is on 1 Corinthians, and so a commentary might take like a deeper dive into one book or section of the Bible. You could have a study Bible, which is going to be a Bible which has maybe different notes and references at the bottom. You'll have Bible dictionaries, which can explain different words and ideas, and even historical commentaries or atlases that can show you where places are and how things work together. Some other examples of tools and resources are maybe you have a small group of believers that you meet with regularly to pray and to study the Bible and God's Word. Maybe you should get one of those, a group of people who believe in God and want to follow Him together in community. And then you may even just have friends that you're having a cup of coffee with, and you say, I read this in the Bible and it seems strange. What do you think? Now, one more thought on reading in community. Remember the TikTok that we started with? Well, Abraham Piper is somebody who's reading the Bible and he's interpreting it. Who are you listening to? Who is your community? What is your ratio of time spent listening to people talk about God or talking about the world to your time spent listening to God yourself? That is your time spent reading the Bible yourself. Do the people who are around you see God as trustworthy? Are they trying to follow Him and to learn who He is on His terms? Or are they focused on other things in their lives as the most important things? And are they seeking to bring the Bible in submission to what they want? So once again, I encourage you to read your whole Bible, know the genre of the material that you're reading, take the interpretive journey, and read your Bible in community, both of the living and even a historical community of believers. In conclusion, I would like to just encourage you to pray as you read that God would open your eyes to see marvelous things from His Word. Those good things are there, and we can see His good character through the correct reading and interpretation of His Word. Thank you.